Chapter 12 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 12 McQueen's Hobby. There isn't much use in talking about the logical or the illogical when you come to couple up with a man's hobby, because a hobby is a hobby, and that's all there is to it, with nothing left to be said on the subject. Most men have a hobby. McQueen's was coal. Just coal. McQueen talked coal with a persistence that was amazing. On all occasions and under any pretext it was coal. When he was off schedule with a regularity that entailed his presence on the carpet before the division superintendent, it was coal. Did he break down between meeting points with the attendant result that the dispatchers fretted and fumed and swore as they readjusted their schedules and rearranged their train sheets, it was coal. Everlastingly and eternally coal. "What's coal?" McQueen would demand oracularly. "It's carbon and oxygen and hydrogen with a dash of nitrogen, ain't it? Well then, what are you talking about? Coal ain't just coal. Some of it's mostly slate. 210 pounds all the way, all the time, with the grate bars cluttered with that. Huh? What?" No purchasing agent that had ever hit the division had been quite able to satisfy McQueen with the brand of the commodity that was supplied in accordance with the requisition orders that he drew. And so, day in and day out, big 802 puffed her way through the mountains, and McQueen in the cab absorbed coal statistics, coal data, coal everything, with an avidity, a thoroughness, and a masterliness of detail that would have put some noted geologists to shame and given the rest a run to hold their rights on the marked up schedule. Up at headquarters, when things were running smoothly and McQueen was behaving himself with no scores chalked up against him on the time card, they treated his hobby as a joke, so that when his whistle boomed out of the gorge to the westward or shrilled across the cut to the eastward, followed a moment afterward by the sight of the big flying mogul with her string of slewing dark green coaches, the staff on duty at Big Cloud would lean from the upper windows and watch the Limited as she shattered the yard switches with a roar, watched as with a hiss of the air and the grinding of the brake shoes as they sparked the tires, she would draw up, panting, at the platform, and the big engineer would swing himself from the cab for an oil around. Then the badinage flew thick and fast while McQueen swabbed his hands on a hunk of waste and punctuated his remarks with squirts from his long-spouted can as he filled the thirsty oil cups. So the big fellows laughed and joked, and the Brotherhood chaffed him unmercifully. If anyone had asked McQueen what had started, let alone caused him to exhaust the subject of coal with such painstaking and conscientious insistence, he couldn't for the life of him have answered. It had started, just started, that's all, and, fascinating him, had pursued its insidious advance unchecked and unquestioned. That is, unquestioned until one morning when Clarihue, the turner at the Big Cloud roundhouse, kind of jerked him up a little on the proposition.
"You're against the red. You and your coal, Mac. All right, all right."
Clarihue chuckled as the engineer came in to sign on for the day's run. McQueen was patting 807's slide bars affectionately. "How's that?" he asked.
"Oil."
"Oil?" repeated McQueen, puzzled.
"Sure thing. No more coal, no more slate, no more cinders. You touch her off and there you are. You'll have to cut out the coal and plug up on oil, Mac."
"Oh," said McQueen, enlightened. "Oil burners, huh? I saw one of them down east. They're evil-smelling, inhuman, stinking brutes, that's what they are. Don't you let 'em sidetrack you like that, son. They may do down there, but not in the hills. Not while you and me are pulling throttles, and don't you think so?"
Clarihue grinned. "Well, maybe," said he. "But say, honest, Mac, what's the sense of gassing about coal the way you do? What's to come out of it? What's the good of it? You just get the laugh from the boys, what?"
McQueen's answer was to scratch his head. To put the matter into the concrete class of practicability was a phase of the subject that he had not considered. He scratched his head when the turner had gone, and also he scratched his head for several days thereafter. Then he caught at a happy inspiration whereby to solve the riddle, and therein he fell, but of that in a moment. Things were booming on the Hill Division. Traffic was doubled, trebled. Everything on the train sheets was in sections. Promotions flew thick and fast. Wipers were set to firing, and the firemen moved over to the right-hand side of the cabs. Every wheel the division could beg, borrow, or steal was doing fancy time stunts, smashing records. Everyone from car tink to superintendent was on the jump. Even the directors, not to be outdone in the general order of things, worked overtime rubbing fat hands in gleeful anticipation of juicy, luscious dividends to be. Only they neglected to figure in Noonan as an item on the balance sheets. Noonan? Where is the brotherhood that does not number among its members men with grievances, fancy or real? Noonan had a grievance, no particular grievance, just a grievance. And Noonan was a power in that branch of the Brotherhood that held sway over the Hill Division. Noonan always had a grievance, due primarily to the fact that he had a deep and long-seated grudge against himself. It dated way back. He'd been born that way.
Grievances,
he sputtered to a group of his admirers.
Grievances? Why, we're against the worst of it all the time. We're not track walkers, are we? Well, Dan, who runs the road? It's us on the throttles, what? Who's to blame for our measly schedule of hours and pay? We are, 'cause we haven't the sand to stand up for our rights. That's what, and don't you forget it.
There was a chorus of assent. Noonan's right, said one Devins, only it don't look to me like now was what you might rightly call the time to growl. Times are good, everything double-headed, and the pay cars running carload lots. Noonan glared.
You got the brains of a piston head, that's what you have, he exploded. It's times like these we'd win hands down. Perhaps you'd like to wait till there's nothing doing, and they're laying the boys off, and everybody mostly is running spare. What chance do you think any demands would stand then?
Of a truth, it was the accepted time and a most glorious opportunity. In that Noonan was right. Only one obstacle lay between him and the accomplishment of his cherished ambition to make something of his trouble-making proclivities and become a leader of men in a strike. That obstacle was McQueen. McQueen was a company man. Out and out a company man. Though nothing would have surprised McQueen more than to learn that he was looked up to as a leader by the conservative element of the Brotherhood. True, he and his coal was the joke of the division. But that was only a joke, and in no wise to be held up against him. His influence, of whose existence he was oblivious, was based on things apart from that. Big, kindly, honest, incapable of deceit, simple, straightforward, staunch in his friendships, somewhat inclined to stubbornness in his beliefs, perhaps, easily ruffled but as easily pacified, such was McQueen. Such was the McQueen the officials honored, and such was the McQueen with whom the boys would gladly and loyally have shared their paychecks to the last cent. All this Noonan knew. Knew, too, that to gain his end he must first win over McQueen, and to that object he began to devote himself. He and McQueen shared the honors of the fast mail, and under ordinary conditions communication between the two men was limited to a flirt of the hand from the cab as one or other of them tore by the siding designated as their meeting point by the lords of the road, the dispatchers. But now things were a bit different. Everything was more or less off schedule, and while the Limited, east and west, was nursed along as near her running time as possible, and generally got the best of it over everything else, there were nevertheless occasions when both men were stalled together on time orders at the same point. Noonan tackled McQueen at the first opportunity. He picked his way cautiously, as though not quite sure of his rights and ready for a quick reverse.
Say, Mac, he began, what do you think of all this talk that's going round?
Talk? Said McQueen. What talk?
You don't mean to say, gasped Noonan in well-simulated surprise, that you haven't heard it? And the boys are slinging it pretty hot at that.
I haven't heard anything, McQueen answered, slightly suspicious that Noonan was about to spring one at his expense. What you giving us?
Straight, confided Noonan earnestly. It's strike, Mac. That's what.
Strike? Ejaculated McQueen, bewildered. What for?
What for? Cried Noonan. What for? That's a sweet question to ask. Well, pretty dash near everything.
He waved his hand expansively.
Hours, scale, and
McQueen shook his head. I'm not kicking, he said. I don't see anything to strike about. Looks to me as though you fellas were hunting trouble. You'll probably get it, what?
You never see anything,
Noonan blurted out, irritation getting the better of diplomacy.
nothing but the blamed coal you're forever yapping about.
What I know about coal, returned McQueen with dignity, you'll never know. It's a subject that requires brains.
Is that so? Noonan jeered. You tell it.
It requires brains, McQueen repeated stolidly.
It's a shame that the only man on the division that has 'em don't know how to use 'em then, Noonan prodded. Who cares about your blazing old coal and what it's made of? Talk's cheap. There's no sense to it anyhow.
Maybe there isn't, and then, again, maybe there is. At any rate, there's $1 a day for every man pulling a throttle, McQueen announced triumphantly. I don't know yet just how much for the firemen. I haven't figured it on their schedule. Noonan pricked up his ears. What's that you say, Mac? He demanded. Here was McQueen's vindication. They'd laugh at his absurd, pointless theories on coal, would they? Well, then, he'd show them. And it wasn't any of their business either how many days he'd racked his brains puzzling out an adequate solution to the question Clarihue had flung at him. He shook two impressive fat fingers at Noonan. $1 a day, every day, and the spare men proportionately, that's what. Do you get that, Noonan? Rats, said Noonan. You'd better go into the shops for repairs. You need new stay bolts on your dome cover. Never you mind my dome cover, McQueen flung back, beginning to get exasperated. It may need a little tinkering, but it's not ready for the scrap heap yet, the way some are I could mention, but won't. It all goes back to what I said. It's a subject that requires brains, which you haven't got any. There's no use explaining anything to you, because— You can't, Noonan interrupted craftily. You're only long on wind, Mac. You listen to me, you rust-jointed disgrace to the throttle, cried McQueen, stung into retort. You listen to me. What are you paid for? Mileage, ain't it? How do you get your mileage? Steam. What makes steam? Coal. Do you hear? Coal. Coal, and don't you forget it. Well, then, poor coal means poor steam, and poor steam means poor mileage. Don't it? What? Noonan burst into a loud and derisive guffaw. McQueen glared. You're a wild, uneducated, hee-hawing ass, he choked. What do you know anyway? Nothing. But I know. $1 a day, I said, and I say so now. I figured it out. It's the difference between the mileage we make and the mileage we could make in the same time. That totes up to $1 a day. Supposing that they wouldn't let us have any more mileage than they do now, well, we'd do it in better time and the difference would be ours, wouldn't it? And time's money. And that totes up to $1 a day just the same. It's the same either way, time or mileage. Take your choice. There, Johnny, that's a good boy. Run along and fetch me a bucket of steam, Noonan scoffed. With a snort of unutterable contempt, McQueen turned to swing himself into his cab. Hold on a minute, Mac, Noonan cried, afraid that he had overstepped himself. Don't get whiffy. I swear I believe you're right. Let's see how you figure it. And McQueen, mollified, figured it. Figured it with the stub of a pencil in greasy, scrawling characters on the back of a time order. As to the process by which the conclusion was arrived at, that was something of which Noonan was in profound and utter ignorance. Whether it was right or wrong he did not know. He never knew, and cared less. Certainly, the result was there. McQueen completed the last figure of his calculations with a flourish. There, he cried exultingly. How about it now, Noonan took the paper, wrinkled his brows, pursed his lips, and stared at it with the air of a connoisseur of calculus. Said he slowly. Are you dead sure it's right, Mac? Right, McQueen fairly yelled, touched in another tender spot. Right! Confound you, it's there in black and white, ain't it? Figures don't lie, do they? Well, what in thunder's wrong with you, then? I wanted to make sure, Mac, that's all. Holy fish plates, I knew it was bad, rotten bad, but I didn't think that they were handing it to us like this. You bet it's bad. It's the worst ever. There's more kinds of coal than there are spikes in the right-of-way from here to Big Cloud and back again. But the coal we get is the last on the list. Bad. That's what I've always said, ain't it? It's fierce, continued Noonan with rising emphasis, and when the boys hear this,
It'll be the last straw. They'll fix 'em.
Fix who? Inquired McQueen blankly.
Why, ain't I telling you? The company.
I was talking about the coal, said McQueen a little uneasily.
Sure you were.
Noonan agreed heartily.
Sure you were, and how the company is robbing every engineer on the division of $1 a day, to say nothing of the firemen and the train crews. It's enough to make a man mad. Well, I should say yes.
I didn't say the company was robbing us, protested McQueen.
What's that?
Cried Noonan sharply, then in apparent disgust.
So your crazy old figures are just gas bag filling like the rest of your coal talk, huh? They did look pretty scaly, and that's a fact. I had my suspicions. That's why I asked you if you were sure they were right. But I might have known they weren't without asking.
Oh, you might you, exploded McQueen, goaded once more into angry outburst. You and your suspicions. Who are you? I'll tell you that they are right, and that's the end of it.
Well, if they're right, why don't you stand by them then? We're being robbed every day we work, ain't we?
Yes, I suppose we are, McQueen admitted reluctantly, but I didn't figure it out for the purpose of—
Mac,
Noonan interrupted unctuously.
Tain't for you nor me to say the purpose it's to be put to. There's others besides us. But I do say, Mac, you're almighty smart.
McQueen shook his head. I'm a company man, he said dubiously.
Company man, of course you are. We're all company men. But right's right and wrong's wrong before anything else. Well, ta-ta, Mac. See you again. I'm off. There's Hake with the tissue. I'll tell the boys where you stand.
It was a somewhat dazed McQueen that in turn pulled himself up into his own cab. He stood in the gangway and squinted meditatively at the coal heaped high on the tender. To his conscientious self-communion, his triumphant vindication had somewhat the appearance of a boomerang. I don't know, he reflected. It is damn poor coal, and figures don't lie. We've been getting the worst of it, and a man should stand up for his rights. And while McQueen, busy with new and momentous problems, was steaming west into the Rockies, Noonan, with his tongue in his cheek, was cutting along for Big Cloud with a wide-flung throttle. That night at Big Cloud, Noonan's cronies got the story. That is, they got what Noonan saw fit to tell them. And the burden of his tale was that McQueen was with the Brotherhood and against the company. That was sufficient. They looked with appreciative admiration at the man who had done the trick, and then they flew to obey his orders. By morning, every engineer on the division had the news. On way freights, on stray freights, on regulars, specials, and sections, they got it, every last one of them. And McQueen, coming east again on number 2, got it, and marveled a little at his new importance, never seeing Noonan's hand in the marked deference paid to him. First and last, it was a bad business. Bad for the company, bad for the hotheads led by Noonan, bad for the others, and bad for McQueen. It caught the company none too well prepared, and Carlton, for this happened in the days of his superintendency, was hard put to move anything. There was pretty bitter feeling, and before it was over there was blood spilled. But the roughs at Big Cloud, who didn't know the pilot from a hornblock, were responsible for most of that, though in their own way, too, they ended it. It came to a showdown the night they carried young Carl Davis home from the yard on a door they had wrenched from a boxcar. Davis was braking in the yard then, and he was a nephew of McQueen's. He had lived with the engineer ever since, as a little chap of 10, he had come out to the West. Childless themselves, McQueen and his wife thought as much of the lad as though he had been their own. McQueen in his grief didn't get the rights of it. Only in a confused sort of a way he understood the roughs had winged the boy with a cowardly shot, meaning perhaps to do no more than shoot out his lamp as he swung by on the top of a car. And while his wife, with tender hands, busied herself in rendering such assistance to the surgeon as she could, McQueen sat in a chair and stared, dry-eyed and bitter of heart, at the white face on the bed. Also, McQueen was getting sense. Certainly he had never intended to strike. Now the shock of Carl's hurt had sobered his judgment, and he saw things as he should have seen them. saw them as he cursed himself for not having seen them before he had allowed his senseless egotism to carry him off his feet. As the thoughts came crowding through his brain, his cheeks burned dull red at his own shame. But through it all he blamed only himself, with never an inkling that he had been used as a cat's paw by the crafty Noonan. That was to come afterward. McQueen waited only to wring a half-grudging assurance from the doctor that the boy would pull through. Then he took his hat and left the house. It was getting on toward 11 o'clock when he walked into the hall across from the station where the boys had their headquarters, and had been in the habit of congregating each night ever since the strike began. Usually noisy in a good-natured, devil-may-care way, there was a subdued and serious quiet pervading the room as McQueen stepped in. The shooting in the yard was something they had not counted on, and, like McQueen, it was acting on them as a tonic. All except Noonan, who, evidently bolstered up by a few drinks, was more noisy, hilarious, and quarrelsome than ever. McQueen answered the questions they crowded at him as to the boy's condition soberly, and going over to Noonan, took him by the arm and led him into a corner. " The game ain't worth it," he said shortly. " I've had my lesson tonight and I'm through."
" What for? " demanded Noonan aggressively. " We didn't have anything to do with it. We're not responsible, are we? "" We are," said McQueen sturdily. " Morally responsible." " Morally responsible," Noonan mocked with a sneer. " Oh, Mama, listen to him. Streak of yeller, that's you, McQueen." Then fiercely, " You play the scab, I'll bash your head to jelly." " You're drunk," retorted McQueen contemptuously. " Drunk, huh? I'm not so drunk but what I know who's running this strike. It's me, and you don't forget it. And what I say goes, d'ye hear? "" I'm asking you to call it off. Blood on our heads I won't stand for. Our grievances don't warrant what's likely to happen here if things go on. You owe it to the men who followed you into the strike, Noonan." " Oh, I do I? Followed me into the strike, huh? How about the men that followed you? "" That followed me? " repeated McQueen in amazement. " Sure they followed you. You don't think I took any stock in your batty coal talk, did you? You must think I'm green. All I wanted was you. You bit fast and easy enough. The rest of the softies came along then like a pack of sheep. What do you think now about me owing it all to the men, Mr. Morally Responsible, huh? " It took McQueen a minute to get the whole of it, the bitter whole of it. Then the blood rushed to his face in a crimson flood. He reached out and, grasping Noonan by the neck and shoulders, shook him as a terrier shakes a rat. " You cur! " he cried hoarsely, and flung the other suddenly away against the wall. The men, at the sound of the scuffle, came running over. " He's a scab! Kill him! " shrieked Noonan. McQueen turned to face the men. " If beating this strike's a scab, I'm a scab," he said quietly. " I'm out to beat it right now. I've been a fool and I'm ready to admit it, but I didn't know until tonight that I'd been bait for a whining thing like that," pointing at Noonan. " He says some of you men came in on the strike because I did. If that's so, then get out of it because I do. Get out of it before there's more on your hands than we'll be able to answer for when we go into division for the last time. That's all I've got to say. I'm going over now to ask Carlton to put me on again, and if it's nothing better than pulling away freight, and I hope you'll come with me." As the flood follows the fracture in the dam, so the breaking of the tension filled the room with pandemonium. Cheers, yells, hisses, curses, shouts. The Brotherhood was divided against itself. But 10 minutes later, the majority of them were clustered behind McQueen in the super's office. Carlton and his staff were sleeping at headquarters those days, and they gathered in a group around the green-shaded lamp on the dispatcher's table to face the delegation. " Mr. Carlton," McQueen began, That was all. He never got any further. From the platform outside came hoots and catcalls, and above the chorus Noonan's voice. " Soak the scab! Kill him! If he's so fond of it, let him have it! Now! The window pane was shivered with a crash, and McQueen, struck full in the head by a huge hunk of coal, sank without so much as a moan to the floor. They cured him of brain fever in the course of time, all right, but they never cured him of coal. Up and down from one end of the division to the other,
When he got around again, he talked coal harder than ever. It was his business. McQueen was doing the buying for the road. "There ain't anything wrong with what I said about coal," he asserts with a smile when the boys put it up to him. "Not for a minute. Good coal makes better steam, better everything, and pays the company. They saw that all right. That's why I'm buying it now, see? As for figuring it into the schedule, the sum was too hard and they couldn't do it. Me? Oh, I can't either. I lost the paper I did it for Noonan on. I ain't so good on figures as I was, huh?" End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Rebate. He was known as Dutchy, but his name was Damrosch. This is Dutchy's story when Dutchy and the Transcontinental were in the making, and before, as has been recorded elsewhere, he came to Big Cloud. He started railroading as cook's helper on a construction gang that was laying track across the prairie. As the mileage grew, so Dutchy grew. At first, lank and lean, he took on, little by little, the appearance of being comfortably nourished, until by the time they hit the Rockies, Dutchy's gait had become a waddle, and his innocent blue eyes were almost hidden by the great rolls of fat that puffed out of his face like a toy balloon. Then Dutchy, slow of body and likewise of brain, and yearning for a quiet and peaceful existence, secured the lunch counter rights for Dry Notch. Now, Dry Notch, halfway across the prairie, consisted of a water tank, a small roundhouse, a smaller station, and a diminutive general store. But because of its geographical position, it was headquarters for the Mid Plains Division. Here, T.V. Brett was superintendent, Thornley was his chief clerk, and MacDonald was dispatcher. And these, with the railroad hands and train crews, comprised the population of Dry Notch, unless there might be added a few ranchers somewhere in the neighborhood. The staff bunked in a room over the station, and the men had their quarters in the roundhouse, but one and all they ate at Dutchy's counter. Sinkers and coffee, apple pie and sandwiches, they stood as a steady diet for a month after he had appeared upon the scene, and then a delegation waited upon him and demanded dishes more substantial. "You can make meat pies and chicken stew and all that sort of thing, can't you?" they demanded. "Sure," said Dutchy, "but that is expensive." Money was no object, they assured him, and thereupon proceeded to fix a schedule of prices. 15 cents for a meat pie, 20 cents for a chicken stew, with 2 slices of bread and butter thrown in for good measure. "Well," said Dutchy, "so is it." And a few nights later, true to his promise, they got their chicken stew. Canned chicken stew. The huge pot full to the brim had been emptied, and Dutchy, his face beaming with smiles, had bustled into the back room for a further supply, when MacDonald's voice suddenly rose plaintively. It's chicken in it." The crowd looked inquiringly at the dispatcher. "Because," went on MacDonald softly, "I never heard of any chicken in Dry Notch." And then, amid the laughter that ensued, Thornley rose dramatically from his seat, and picking up a bone from his plate, waved it aloft. "Gentlemen, this is no time for mirth," he cried. "We are victims of a swindle. We are in the clutch of an octopus, that is to say, a food trust, composed of Dutchy and the dining car conductors of number 1 and 2. It is my painful duty to assert that I recognize this bone as the identical bone on which I fed 2 nights ago coming up the line on number 1. Dutchy entered, staggering under the load of the replenished pot, when Thornley solemnly demanded a rebate on the spot. "Was is it?" said Dutchy, halting and peering passionately into the pot, then, evidently reassured that no essential ingredient had been forgotten, he looked up at the ring of faces that were regarding him with grave inquiry. "Was is a rebate?" he demanded. "It's something you smith the bread and butter for 20 cents to go, yes?" The crowd roared, and up and down the division train crews, engine crews, and section gangs got the joke, and passed it on until the lunch counter became known to every man on the system as the Rebate. They did not explain the joke to Dutchy, and for days he endured the chaff stolidly, though with much bewilderment, until one afternoon MacDonald patiently and ploddingly acquainted him with the unhallowed baseness of one Thornley, helping himself by way of compensation to the heap of doughnuts under the glass cover. Dutchy listened, his cheeks getting redder and redder as MacDonald, exaggerating some hundredfold, suavely rubbed it in. " That Thornley is a pig! " shouted Dutchy suddenly as the light burst in upon him. MacDonald nodded assent, his mouth too full of doughnut to speak. " Und I a fool is, yes? " continued the proprietor, pounding a fat fist on the counter. Again MacDonald nodded, smiling sweetly, and reached for another doughnut. But this time Dutchy's fingers were firmly clasped around the cover, and he peered suspiciously through the glass at the number of doughnuts remaining, then glared at the dispatcher. " You get out from here," he said slowly, but with rising emphasis, and MacDonald, chuckling, went. It was not until after supper that same evening, when Number One pulled in, that Dutchy made any move toward retribution. Then Dutchy cut loose. It was Taggart who got it, little Shorty Taggart, the driver of Number One, who was red-haired and an inveterate joker, and likewise a great crony of Thornley's. The first intimation MacDonald had that anything was up was an enraged howl that, rising from the tumult of the station, reached him where he sat in the dispatcher's office. There was no mistaking the voice. It was Dutchy's. MacDonald stuck his head hastily out of the window, while Thornley, who was in the room, leaned over his shoulder. Dutchy was bellowing like a mad bull. " Say it! Shust say it! Oh, Pike Cully! " Here followed a volcanic eruption of guttural German with one or two words common to all languages intermingled. Then, flying through the doorway of the lunchroom, dashing down the platform, scattering loungers, passengers, and car tinks in all directions, in a mad rush for the engine end of the train, tore a short figure in tight-fitting, bandy-legged overalls, whose flaming red hair presented a shining mark for the plate that whizzed past his ear and smashed into 100 pieces against a baggage truck. And Dutchy, blowing hard, his sleeves rolled up over the fat of his arms, waddled to the center of the platform and shook a frantic fist after the retreating engineer. " I a fool is no longer yet, don't it? " he screamed. And puffing his cheeks in and out like a wheezy injector, he turned, re-entered the restaurant, and the door closed behind him with a resounding bang. MacDonald drew in his head, and the tears were running down his cheeks as he held his sides. Thornley groped for a chair. " Guess Packard was asking for a rebate," he gasped. " It was worth pay to see him run." " You bet," said MacDonald eloquently, when he could get his breath. The door opened, and Brett, the super, came in. " D'ye see Taggart and Dutchy, Brett? " cried Thornley. " Yes," said Brett, laughing. Then more seriously, " Look here, you'd better patch it up with Dutchy. There's no use rubbing it in too hard. MacDonald, tell Blaney to put my car on Number 2 when she comes in. I'm going East tonight." The patching, however, was quite a different matter than talking about it. The next morning the lunchroom door was ominously closed, and the staff went breakfastless. By listening at the keyhole and from an occasional glimpse through the window, they knew that Dutchy was inside. But to pleadings, threats, and door kickings, the occupant was to all intents and purposes oblivious. Things began to look serious for the staff and station hands who were wont to depend on Dutchy for their grubstakes. Thornley whistled softly and pulled at his pipe, his feet on the dispatcher's desk. " We'll have to open up when Number 97 pulls in," Thornley was saying, more by way of reassuring himself than of presenting any new view of the case to MacDonald. " The company won't stand for any inconvenience to the passengers, that is," he hastened to amend, " not of that kind. Well, they've got a sort of lien on that joint, and if he waits for them to get after him, he'll get into trouble. Wish Brett were back. He'd make him open up quick, I guess. What's the matter with Number 97, anyhow? Thought you said she was on time." " So she is," said MacDonald, grinning. " Hear her? " From the eastward came the hoarse shriek from the whistle of a 500 class. " Guess I'll go down," said Thornley. " Coming? " MacDonald nodded and got up from his chair. The two men reached the platform in time to acknowledge a flirt of the hand from Sanders in the cab as the big machine, wheel tires sparking from the tight-set brakes, rolled slowly past them, coming to a halt further on. Simultaneously the door of the lunchroom swung wide open, and on the threshold, completely filling the opening with his bulk, stood Dutchy. In his left hand he held his bell, which he began to ring clamorously. In his right hand, almost but not quite concealed behind his apron, was no less a weapon than a substantial-looking rolling pin. A crowd of passengers began to surge toward the restaurant, and among them mingled the hungry railroad men of Dry Notch. " Go on! " shouted Thornley exultantly. " I knew he'd have to open up. Here's where we feed, huh? "" Wait! " cried Dutchy imperiously, as the head of the column reached him. " You, yes. You, no. What is it? " He was sorting the sheep from the goats, allowing the passengers to enter, pushing the railroaders ruthlessly to one side. " You, yes. You, no. You, yes. You, oh, py golly! " He had caught sight of Thornley, and swinging suddenly struck out viciously in that direction with the rolling pin. Being obliged, however, to maintain his position in the doorway, the strategic key to the situation, the jab fell short by 2 or 3 inches, barely missing Thornley's nose. Thornley fell back instinctively. " But look here, you old ass! " he yelled angrily. " We've had about enough of this. It's just a joke. The company's got a lien on that joint of yours, and we'll close it up so tight you'll never open it again. Do you hear? " Dutchy stopped short in the monotonous "you, yes, you, no," on which he had recommenced, and his paunch began to shake. " Yah !" he cried. " Dot is a joke. Oh, by golly, lien! Dot is when you get gestorven yet, yah? Ha! Ho, 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 ha, ha, ha! " In Dutch's burst of merriment, first one and then another joined, until even Thornley, his good nature getting the better of him, roared with the rest at his own expense. But if this apparent return to good humor on Dutchy's part inspired any hope in the minds of the railroad men that he had relented and that the former friendly relations were to be resumed, they were doomed to disappointment. For Dutchy stolidly continued to allow the passengers to go in and as stolidly barred the entrance of the others. Then they gave it up and bought out the slender stock of canned goods and biscuits from the shelves of the general store. They messed in the baggage room, and they swallowed their scanty portions to the tune of Die Wacht am Rhein, bellowed out by a strong and sonorous voice through the partition, on the other side of which, laid out in tempting confusion, as they were painfully aware, was plenty. What they had, however, did little more than whet their appetites, and by 3 o'clock some of the men were talking of carrying the position by storm, helping themselves, and doing a few fancy stunts with Dutchy. " But we can't have any row," said Thornley, pulling at his mustache and staring at MacDonald. " What had we better do? The boys will be pulling the old chap down around his ears. He'll fight like blazes, and someone will get hurt. And then the company will want to know what's what. Say, the old geezer has got us where he wants us, sure. Huh? What? " MacDonald nodded. " I'll tell you what it is," Thornley went on impressively. " There's someone besides Dutchy in this. They've been giving him a steer, and I'd give a few to know who it is. It's mighty queer Dutchy would wake up so suddenly to the fact that he was a joke. Then there isn't anything to that rebate josh to make him so sure. Someone's been stringing him good and plenty. What had we better do? "" I don't know," MacDonald answered. " Let's go and see if we can't talk him over." At the sight of Thornley and the dispatcher heading for the lunchroom, the trainmen and station hands fell in behind them. MacDonald halted a few paces from the door. " You boys stay here," he directed. " Let me see what I can do." Thornley and the men halted obediently while MacDonald went on and knocked at the door. There was no response. Mr. Damrosch," he called. " It's MacDonald. I want to talk to you." This time his knock was answered, and so suddenly as to cause him to jump back in surprise. " Well, what is it? " demanded Dutchy, scowling belligerently. " We're " stammered MacDonald, his confidence a little shaken at the proprietor's attitude. Then, desperately, " Oh, I say, confound it all, Dutchy, we're hungry." " So !" Dutchy's exclamation was a world of innocent astonishment and kindly interest. Yes, went on MacDonald diplomatically. You bet we are. It's been a good joke, but you've had the best end of it. Let's call it quits, that's a good fella, and give us all a hand out. Dutchy listened attentively to the appeal. Aye, a fool is no longer yet, don't it? He queried softly. You most decidedly are not, MacDonald assured him. You will for rebates no longer ask yet? Persisted Mr. Damrosch. Not on your life, replied the dispatcher earnestly, beginning to see daylight. That's all off. We'll apologize, too, if you like. I promise you, we are quite willing to apologize. Well, then, announced Mr. Damrosch, we will aggravate. And he slammed the door in MacDonald's face. Oh, hold on, Dutchy, cried MacDonald piteously, for he was very hungry. What did you say? What I said is that we will aggravate, shouted Dutchy from the other side of the door. That is English, don't it? Aggravate? He means arbitrate, prompted Thornley from the platform. Oh, all right, said MacDonald. We'll agree to that, Dutchy. Come on, open up. I will not make you do it. Hand that word, Dutchy asserted decisively, but again opening the door. But Mr. Brett, I will do it. But Mr. Brett isn't here, you know that, retorted MacDonald, beginning to get exasperated. And what's more, he won't be back until the day after tomorrow. I guess you know that, too, don't you? Dutchy smiled a patient, chiding smile. That is too bad, he remarked regretfully. But that Thornley a pig is, and you, oh, by golly, you, I could not you believe. We will wait for Mr. Brett. He was closing the door again when MacDonald put his foot against the jamb and, leaning toward Dutchy, said quickly, in an undertone, Look here, Dutchy, you're going too far. If I couldn't see any further than you, I'd wear glasses. Now's the time to make your deal. I'll help you, see? You can get anything out of the boys now, and you push them too far, and they'll pull the whole outfit down over your ears. You say what you want, and I'll get it for you. Dutchy looked meditatively into MacDonald's face, and shook his head with a sad smile of wisdom. I could not you believe, he repeated. You don't have to. You don't have to believe anybody. Whatever you want us to do, we'll do before you let us in to eat. You can't lose. What do you say? Mr. Damrosch scratched his head pensively without taking his eyes off the dispatcher. After a minute he tapped MacDonald on the shoulder. Well, he announced, I will tell you. Listen. MacDonald listened incredulously. Then he whistled a low, long-drawn-out note of consternation. Well, you got a nerve, he gasped. What do you think, huh? The boys'll never... He stopped suddenly, a smile came over his face, and he chuckled softly to himself. Dutchy, you're great. It'll be meat for the boys to make Thornley stand for it. That's what you want to do, make Thornley stand for it. Will the boys make him? Oh, will they? Give them a chance. That's the way to handle it. I told you I'd help you. Now, make your spiel. MacDonald turned to the group on the platform. Dutchy'll arbitrate, he cried. At this the men began to push forward, but Dutchy stopped them. Wait as you is. When hang that word. Is, then is it. Wait. They waited, and Dutchy began to count on his fingers. There is 16 that breakfasted, didn't, he began. That is, average 'em up at a quarter apiece, prompted MacDonald in a whisper. That makes $4. Is $4, yes, went on Dutchy. Well, I want that. There is the crews that in came and out went and didn't eat when the door was closed. That is $2, yes? Well, I want that. The men came to, and a roar of derision rent the air, in the face of which even Dutchy was a little shaken. Stand pat, encouraged MacDonald. You got them coming and going. Dutchy held up his hand for silence. There is the 16 over again yet that dinnered didn't. That is $4, yes? Well, I want that. That is 4 and 2 and 4. That is $10, don't it? Well, I want that, and then you come in. Yes, 1 by 1, for a quarter by each. Then, amid the storm of abuse and jeers that greeted Dutchy's ultimatum, MacDonald, with a final injunction to the proprietor to stand by his guns, turned and joined Thornley and the men.
Well, Pike-Collie,
Screamed Dutchy above the din.
what is it? Who was the commencer of that joke that is $10 to pay? It is that Thornley.
"By you wretched old thief," yelled Thornley. "Do you think we're going to pay you for grub we didn't get because you wouldn't let us in to have it, and then pay you for it again when you do dole it out? We'll see you further first."
It was agreed in front of the... Hang that word. By the...
"Agreed nothing,"
Snorted Thornley.
That you will for rebates no longer ask yet, don't it? Well, the price $10 is. There is no rebate. Oh, by golly, Mr. Thornley, that was an expensive joke, yes? That was your joke, and I just thought me that I hope you will pay that yourself.
Thornley paid. With no good grace, but because, as MacDonald had said they would, the men made him. Disgruntled and angry, he led the file into the restaurant, placing $10.25 in Dutchy's hand before he crossed the threshold. Behind him followed MacDonald and the grinning line of men, each contributing their quarters, in advance, for the first square meal they had had that day.
Eat what you like,
said Dutchy magnanimously. Thornley glared.
"Eat what you like, eat what you like,"
he mimicked savagely.
"I like your colossal generosity at my expense."
For a long time there was no other noise save the rattle of dishes and the busy clatter of knives, forks, and spoons. Then Thornley beckoned to Dutchy.
Well, what is it?
Inquired the proprietor from behind the counter.
"Who put you on to this?"
demanded Thornley.
"I've had to stand for it, and I'd like to know. I would that."
MacDonald, sitting beside Thornley, noticed with some misgivings a peculiar expression sweep over Dutchy's face, but to his relief the proprietor's only reply was a grunt as he answered a call for more coffee.
"By the hokey, I'll bet it was that red-haired Packard!"
exclaimed Thornley suddenly, turning to the dispatcher. MacDonald buried his face in his cup, ostensibly to drain the last drop. Then he set it down quickly and jerked his watch from his pocket.
Holy Moses!
He ejaculated and fled from the room. An hour later, as Thornley was again sitting with his feet on MacDonald's desk, Dutchy stuck his head into the room and beckoned to the dispatcher. MacDonald walked across the room and joined him. Dutchy pulled him out of the room and closed the door.
There is one thing that I forgot it did,
announced Mr. Damrosch.
What's that? Inquired MacDonald. There is 5 doughnuts that is paid for not.
Oh, said MacDonald.
That was the time you told that it was Thornley, yes? That was $1 per each. Well, I want that, yes?
Really?
Laughed MacDonald. Well, I guess not. That was the time.
Dutchy was raising his voice, each word growing louder and more distinct than the preceding one. Thornley's chair inside creaked ominously. MacDonald glanced furtively toward the door, and his face grew red.
You told that?
With a hasty movement, MacDonald clapped one hand over Dutchy's mouth and with the other thrust a $5 bill into his fingers.
Get out!
He choked and shoved Dutchy violently toward the stairs. At the bottom, Dutchy halted, turned, and looked up with a grin.
By golly, said he, I just thought me that I like jokes pretty good, and I hope that... Oh, shut up, said MacDonald.
End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 14, Speckles. This happened at a period in the history of the Hill Division when trade was very bad, and the directors, scowling over the company's annual report, threw up their hands in holy horror, while from the sacred precincts of the boardroom there emanated the agonized cry, "Economy!" The general manager took up the slogan and dinned it into the ears of the division superintendents. "Operating expenses are too high," he wrote. "They must be cut down." And the superintendents of divisions, painfully alive to the fact that the GM was not dictating for the mere pleasure of it, intimated in unmistakable language to the heads of departments under them that the next quarterly reports were expected to show a marked improvement. John Healy, had charge of the roundhouse at Big Cloud in those days, and the morning after the lightning struck the system, he came fuming back across the yards from his interview with the superintendent, stuttering angrily to himself. As he stamped into the running shed, his humor a shade worse than usual, the first object that caught his eye was Speckles, squatted on the lee side of 483, dangling his legs in the pit. That is, it would have been the lee side if Healy had come in the other door.
Cut down operation expenses, is it?
Healy muttered.
Begorra, I begin right now.
And he fired Speckles on the spot. Now Speckles, whose name, by the way, was Dolliver Washington Babson, had been fired on several occasions before, and if he swallowed a little more tobacco juice than was good for his physical comfort, it was rather as a gulp of startled surprise at Healy's appearance than because of any poignant regret at the misfortune that had overtaken him. Nevertheless, he felt it incumbent on himself to expostulate.
Get out and stay out,
said Healy, refusing to argue, and Speckles got out. For a day he kept away from the roundhouse, the length of time past experience had taught him was required to cool the Turner's anger. Then he sauntered down again and came face to face with Healy on the turntable.
" I came down to ask you to put me on again, Mr. Healy,"
he began, broaching the subject timidly.
" What?
" demanded Healy.
" I came down to ask you to put me on again, Mr. Healy,"
Speckles repeated monotonously.
" Oh, I heard you, said
Healy a little inconsistently.
" On again, is it? It'll be a long time, me son, mark that."
This being quite different from Healy's accustomed,
"Well, get back to your job."
It began to filter vaguely through Speckles' brain that his name was no longer to adorn the company's pay sheets.
" Am I fired for good, Mr. Healy? "
he faltered.
" You are," said Healy, " just that."
Then, relenting a little as Speckles' face fell,
" If 'twere not for the big bugs down yonder,"
he jerked his thumb in the general direction of the east,
" I might, mind I don't say I would, but I might put you on again. As it is, we've instructions to cut down the operating expenses, and that's an end of it."
Speckles stood for a moment in dismay as Healy went back into the roundhouse. Then he turned disconsolately away, crossed the tracks to the platform of the station, and, seeking out a secluded corner of the freight house, sat down upon a packing case to think it out. To Speckles it was no mere matter of cutting down expenses. It was a blasted career. Whatever Speckles' faults, and he was only a lad, he had one redeeming quality, before which, in the eyes of the business he had elected to follow, his strayings from the straight and narrow path dwindled into insignificance. Railroading was born in him. At 10 he had started in as caller for the night crews, and during the 5 years the company had had the benefit of his valuable services in that capacity, there was not a man on the division but sooner or later came to know long-armed, bony, freckle-faced, red-haired Speckles, came to know the little rascal, and like him, too. Then Speckles had been promoted to the post of sweeper in the roundhouse, and occasionally, under Healy's critical inspection, to washing out boiler tubes. Fresh fuel thereby added to the fire of his ambition, he began to figure how long it would be before he got to wiping, then to firing, and after that, even Speckles' boundless optimism did not have the temerity to specify any particular date, the time when he would attain his goal and get his engine. Now, instead, at the age of 16, he found himself seated on a cracker box, his dreams for the future rudely shattered, thanks to Healy, old sour face Healy. So Speckles sighed, and as he sighed, the shop whistle blew. It was noon, and the men began to pour out of the big gates. Then Speckles, remembering that the schools were also letting out, hurried down the platform and up the main street. He would confide in Madge. Madge would understand. Madge Bolton was the daughter of the ticket agent at the station, and between Mr. Bolton and Speckles there existed a standing feud, the casus belli being 15-year-old blue-eyed Madge. Speckles kicked his heels on the corner until she appeared, then he turned and fell into step beside her, reaching a little awkwardly for her strap of books. " Hello, doll," was Madge's greeting. She was the only person in Big Cloud who did not call him Speckles.
" Hello, Madge," he returned.
Madge glanced at his face and hands. " Haven't you been to work? " she asked. " Nope." "Why, doll?" " Fired." said Speckles laconically.
" Oh, doll again! " she cried reproachfully. " What for? "" 'Tain't only the third time, and wasn't for nothing," said Speckles, a bit sullenly. " I was only resting." " Tolliver Babson," she accused, " you were loafing. Oh, doll, you'll never get to firing, and " She hesitated and stopped, her cheeks a little red with the hint of boy and girl castle building that would have increased her father's ire against the luckless Speckles had he seen it. Speckles, somewhat shamefaced, and having no excuse to offer, trudged on in silence. " Did you ask Mr. Healy to take you back? " she inquired after a moment. " He won't," said Speckles. " What are you going to do, doll? "" I don't know." " Well," said Madge hopefully, " perhaps you could get a job in one of the stores. I'll ask Mr. Timmons, the grocer, if you like. I know him pretty well." Speckles came to an abrupt and sudden halt, cast in Madge's face one look that carried with it a world of unutterable reproach, handed over her books in silence, and fled. He, a railroad man, go into a store! And this from Madge! Madge, who of all others, it was too much. Speckles ate his dinner, dispirited and crushed. Everything and everybody was against him. His mother's curt inquiry as to when he was going back to work did not in any way tend to mitigate his troubles, rather, on the contrary, to accentuate them. " Old Sour Face won't put me back," he jerked out, in response to his mother's repeated question. " No wonder he won't," said his mother sharply. " If you're so disrespectful as that, I'm ashamed of you, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Speckles was too much depressed to offer any defense. He finished his meal in silence, gulped down his cup of tea in 2 swallows, took his hat, and started out. Unconsciously he directed his steps toward the yards, and some 5 minutes later arrived at the station. Here, about halfway down the platform, he spotted Mat Bolton in the open doorway of the ticket office. As he approached, the nonchalant air with which the other leaned with folded arms against the jamb of the door aroused Speckles' suspicions. To reach the seat of his meditations, the cracker box in the freight shed, which had now become his objective point, he would be obliged to pass Mr. Bolton. He therefore began to incline his course toward the edge of the platform nearest the rails, so that when he came opposite the office door some 15 feet were between him and his arch enemy. Mr. Bolton awoke from his lethargy with surprising suddenness. " You young rascal !" he shouted. " What have you been doing to my girl? I'll teach you to make girls cry, you little speckle faced runt, you! " He made a dash for Speckles, but by the time he had recovered his balance and saved himself from toppling over the edge of the platform to the tracks, Speckles had reached the safe retreat of the freight shed door. And as the irate parent, after shaking his fist impotently, walked back and disappeared within his domain, Speckles indulged in a series of pantomimes in which his fingers and his nose played an intimate and comprehensive part. Perched once more on the cracker box, Speckles again resolved himself into a committee on ways and means. His little skirmish with Madge's father had exhilarated him to such an extent that his heavy and oppressing sense of despondency had vanished, and in its place came a renewed determination to resume, somehow or other, the railroad career that Healy had so emphatically interrupted. He turned over in his mind the feasibility of applying to Regan, the master mechanic, for a job in the shops, but dismissed the idea almost immediately on the ground that shopmen were not, strictly speaking, railroaders. He might start in switching and braking and work up to conductor. That at least was railroading, not to be compared with engine driving, not by long odds, but still it was railroading. His face brightened. He would interview Farley, the trainmaster. Farley was in his office. Speckles had not very far to go, only a few steps down the platform. All the offices, and Big Cloud was division headquarters, were under the same roof. At Speckles' request, Farley swung around in his swivel chair with a quizzical expression on his face. Then he grinned. " Want to go on the train cruise, eh? What do you think, kid, that I'm running a kindergarten outfit? Even if some of them do act like it. How old are you? "" 16," said Speckles, with sinking heart. " 16, eh? If they'll come back in a couple of years and " But for the second time that day Speckles fled. He was in no mood to stand more chaffing, and Farley, as he well knew, had a leaning that way. Speckles halted outside the door, undecided what move to make next.
when the clicking of the instruments in the dispatcher's room overhead came to his ears like an inspiration. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Spence, who had been on the night trick most of the years that Speckles was caller, was now chief dispatcher. If he had any friend anywhere, it was Spence, the man at whose elbow he had sat through those long, dark hours of the night that begat confidences, and into whose ears he had so often poured the tales of his cherished aims and ambitions. Speckles covered the stairs 3 steps at a time in his new-found exuberance. Spence looked up from his key and listened as Speckles told his story. " So you're Healy's contribution to economy, huh? " he said when Speckles had finished. " And he won't take you back? "" No," said Speckles. " Well, that's pretty tough. But I don't see how I can help you any, Speckles. I haven't any rights over Healy, you know." Speckles hesitated a moment and fidgeted nervously from one foot to the other.
" I know you ain't," he began, " but I thought maybe you'd put me on here." "What?" ejaculated Spence. Then, smothering a laugh at the sight of Speckles' woebegone countenance, he demanded gravely, " You mean dispatching? " Speckles nodded. " No, Speckles, that would never do. You go back and see Healy. I'll do what I can for you with him." " 'Twon't do no good," said Speckles hopelessly. " I've asked him twice already." " Well, ask him again. Look here, Speckles, it's up to you to square yourself with Healy, somehow or other. If you want your job very badly, you ought to be sharp enough to find a way of getting it. Go on now." So Speckles descended the stairs to the platform and irresolutely began to cross the tracks in the direction of the running shed. He reached the roundhouse and skirmished cautiously along its front. No Healy was in sight, so he dived in between 2 engines and made his way to the rear of the shed. Here, by peering around the end of a tender, he could see Healy's cubbyhole Healy called it an office a bit of space about 4 by 6 partitioned off from the back wall in the corner, with a greasy book the engine crews signed, and 2 or 3 others, equally greasy, in which Healy kept tabs on things in general. In spite of his trepidation, Speckles grinned. Healy was there, bending over a very flimsy, spindle-legged table that he had wheedled out of the claim agent some months before. His brows were puckered into a ferocious scowl, and he growled and muttered to himself, now laboring furiously with a stubby pencil on the sheets of paper in front of him, now pausing to bite that unoffending article almost in 2 in his desperation. Healy was working on his invention. All the division knew about Healy's ideas on Westinghouse and air, and that these ideas, when perfected, were to be patented. As to what the consensus of opinion of their value was, is neither here nor there, except that in Healy's presence, when referred to at all, the subject was treated with dignity and respect. For Healy's physical powers were beyond the ordinary, and dearest to Healy's heart and most sacred in his eyes was this creation of his brain, or, to be more accurate, fancy. Speckles sidled up to the cubbyhole and, without any peroration, took the plunge. " I came to ask you to put me on again, Mr. Healy."
He spoke rapidly, as though he feared his courage might ooze out before he could finish. Healy wheeled around with a grunt. " Oh, it's you, is it? " he demanded grimly. Speckles, ready to run at the first sign of violence, acknowledged the impeachment by nodding his head affirmatively, and smiled sheepishly while Healy scrutinized him with a long stare from head to foot. " Well," said Healy, " you wait a minute, and I'll give you me answer." Speckles' heart bounded in joyous hope. Healy very deliberately gathered up his papers, folded them carefully, and, opening the cupboard where his coat hung it was a hot day and Healy was in his shirt sleeves tucked them into the inside pocket. Then, like a flash, he turned and reached for the first thing in sight. It was a broom. But quick as he was, Speckles was quicker, and he led Healy by the length of the pit as he dodged around the tail end of a tender and darted out of the running shed across the tracks to the freight house. Healy followed no farther than the turntable. Then he halted, and Speckles, from his retreat, saw him shake his fist and listened to the threat that thundered across the yards. " Show your face around here again, you young rascal, and I'll bait the life out of you, so I will." Speckles betook himself to the cracker box, and from his lips there flowed a fluent and unrestrained expression of his opinion on things in general, but more particularly of Healy, and more particularly still of Healy's invention. Then, his indignation subsiding, it was followed by a fit of the blues, so that when at the expiration of half an hour Healy, still in his shirt sleeves, came out of the roundhouse and walked up the tracks in the direction of the shops, Speckles, through the freight house door, remarked the incident in complete apathy and as one in which he had no interest whatever. 10 minutes later, however, his apathy vanished and he sprang to his feet at the sound of the excited shouts of the men in the running shed. Some were hastily swinging the big engine doors wide open, others were setting the table in position, while one started on a run in the direction Healy had taken. Another minute and the shop whistle had boomed out its warning, and as Healy, with the man who had gone after him, came tearing down the track like mad, Speckles saw the smoke beginning to curl up over the roof at the back. The running shed was afire. With a whoop, Speckles traversed the platform, leaped to the rails, and was hard on Healy's heels by the time the turntable was crossed. Healy paused but an instant. The thing to do was to get the engines out, and Healy was the man to do it.
" Get tackle rigged on 463, he ordered. " She's cold and we'll have to haul her out. Set the table for 518. I'll take her."
Then he started on the jump for the cubbyhole and his precious papers. Now, the tackle that Healy had referred to was stored in the rear of the roundhouse in the same general direction as the cubbyhole, and as the order had been given to no one in particular, Speckles, shouting, "I'll get it," started after Healy. Some grease and waste had caught and was rolling up a nasty smoke. Through it, even while he tugged manfully at the heavy tackle, Speckles saw Healy run into his office, snatch his coat, rush out again, and dash for the cab of 518, throwing the coat up on the tender. As he did so, something fell from the pocket. Speckles dropped the tackle and pounced upon it. It was the bundle of papers he had seen Healy put in his coat pocket a little while before. It was Healy's invention. Speckles' first impulse was to shout to Healy, but just then 518 glided out of the shed, and the men in front of 463 were yelling in chorus for the tackle, so Speckles put his tongue in his cheek and the papers in his pocket. It wasn't much of a blaze, but it looked bad while it lasted. Even after the shop hands had got their hose lengths connected and a stream playing on the fire, and the engines were all in safety in the yard, the smoke continued to roll out in clouds, with here and there a vicious tongue of flame. Then Healy, his duty done, bethought him of his coat on the tender of 518. And Speckles, as he heard Healy's gasp of dismay on discovering that his papers were gone, had an inspiration. " Me papers! Me papers! " wailed Healy. " For the love of Mike, I must have dropped them on the floor."
" I'll get them for you, Mr. Healy," said
Speckles, quick as a shot.
" You're not," said Healy. " I'll have no one risk his life for them, bad as I want them. Hey, come back, you runt." But Speckles was gone, headed straight for the big, yawning doors that vomited their smoke and flames. Oh, no, not Speckles. Hardly. Speckles would make his attempt from the rear, and around the end of the shed and in behind he raced. Some of the men were fighting the fire from that side, but they were too busy to pay any attention to Speckles. A dab of soot and dirt on his face, which he obtained by rubbing his fingers along the blackened wall, an artistic smudge of generous proportions on the outside of the papers, which he took from his pocket, and Speckles' make-up was complete and convincing. Now, Speckles had an eye for the dramatic and an appreciation of its value. He peered in through one of the windows. It was not nearly as bad inside as it had been, and he decided there would be no risk and very little discomfort in carrying out the plan that had popped into his head. So he climbed in through a window, and he dropped down on the floor on the other side. The next minute he had dashed through the running shed, and emerging from a whirl of black smoke into the open in front of the turntable, the papers waved aloft in his fist. It was effective, decidedly effective. A cheer went up and the men crowded around, while Healy rushed forward and began to pump Speckles' arm up and down like an engine piston. " That's a hero you are, me bright jewel of a lad," he cried in his delight. " 'Tis meself, John Healy, as says it, and the boys are me witness. Come back to your job in the morning, and by my soul, Speckles, I'll never fire you again, never. And it's more I'll do. I'll promote you. That's a wiper you are from now on, me son, and to blazes with cutting down operating expenses. Where did you find the papers? "" On the floor," said Speckles, and he told the truth. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 15 Munford Munford came to work before the gangs were deep enough into the hills to lose daily, or rather nightly, touch with Big Cloud. And the way of his coming was this. The town, springing up in a night, had its beginning in the wooden shanty the engineers built as headquarters for the Hill Division that was to be. Then, with mushroom growth, came shacks innumerable, and these shacks for the most part were gambling hells and dives and saloons, and the population was Indian, Chinese, and bad American. To these places of lurid entertainment flocked the toilers at night, loading down the construction empties as they backed their way to the spurs and sidings that soon spread out like a cobweb around headquarters. Naturally, rows were of pretty frequent occurrence between the company's men and the leeches who bled them with crooked games and stacked decks over the roulette, faro, and stud poker tables. But of them all, in the delectable pursuit of separating the men and their pay checks, Pete McGonigle's Golden Luck saloon was in the van, both as to size and crookedness, and that high station of eminence it maintained until the night a stranger wrecked it by no more delicate a method than of kicking over the roulette table, sending it and the attendant, who was presiding over the little whirling ball in Pete's interest, crashing to the floor. That stranger was Munford, and that was how Munford came to join the army of the Rockies. A number of company men were present, and they sided in with Munford. Before this amalgamation, Pete and his hangers-on went down to ignominious defeat, and the Golden Luck to utter demolishment and ruin. News of the fracas spread rapidly to the other joints. The dive keepers joined forces, the company men did likewise, and that night became the wildest in the history of Big Cloud. Munford took command of his new-found friends from the start. In the street fight that followed he did wondrous things, and did them with zest, delight, and effectiveness. With his great bulk he towered above his companions, and the sweep of his long arms as they rose and fell, the play of his massive shoulders as he lunged forward to give impetus to his blows, was a marvelous sight to see. But the details of that fight have no place here. Its result, however, was that Munford, previously unknown and unheard of, became thereafter a marked man in Big Cloud. When the fight was over, the company men, elated with victory, though somewhat the worse for wear, retired to the yard to wait for the construction trains to take them up to their work. And while they waited, they spent the time gazing in admiration at Munford, who sat on the edge of a flat car, his legs dangling over, blowing softly on his knuckles, a smile of divine contentment on his face. What was Munford going to do? Demanded McGuire and the cronies of his particular gang who had the honor of being present at Pete's when the evening's proceedings were instituted, and who therefore felt they had a prior claim to the hero's consideration over and above that of the men from other sections of the work who had taken part in the fight. Munford did not know. Would he go up the line with them and take a job with their gang if they promised to get him one? Munford would. So he kept his seat when the construction train pulled out just as the dawn was breaking, and 20 miles up the road at Twin Bear Creek they tumbled him off and introduced him to Allen Burton, foreman of Bridge Gang No. 3. At the sight of his battered and jaded crew, who in no wise appeared fit for the day's work before them, Burton swore savagely and with great bitterness of tongue bade them get to their work. Then he turned in his ill humor to Munford, who was still standing beside him. "Who the devil are you? What are you doing here? Where do you come from?" The questions came quick and sharp like a volley of small arms. Munford eyed the wiry little chunk of a man, scarcely up to his own shoulders, in silence, taking him in from head to foot. "Well," snapped Burton, "speak up." "Munford's my name," said Munford coolly. "I'm here for a job. Where I come from ain't none of your blamed business, is it?" "Ain't it?" said Burton. "Well, then, you can walk back there, my bucko." And he turned on his heel and followed the men to their work. Munford sat down on the door sill of the camp shanty and with a laugh pulled out his pipe and began to smoke. He was still sitting there a half hour later when the foreman came back. "If you've got far to go," grinned Burton, "you'd better get started."
No hurry,
replied Munford imperturbably. You're a queer card, said Burton after a moment. What's this about the trouble down at Big Cloud last night the boys are so full of they can't do anything besides talk? Munford chuckled quietly.
nothing much,
said he. Nothing much, They say you put the Golden Luck and Pete McGonigal to the bad and then cleaned out every dive in town. You're quite a reformer, ain't you? I'll tell you this, though. It won't be healthy for you around these parts from now on.
Oh, I know that, said Munford. Say, how about that job?
Burton laughed. You've got a sweet nerve to ask for a job, and you're responsible for a gang that won't be able to do a day's work among the lot of them between now and night. Get up McGonigals, Well, I don't know. I reckon in the long run that'll be worth more to the company than the day's work. All right, sport, you can go to work, until Pete and his crowd scare you out, which I predict won't be long. And while you're here, if you get itchy for trouble, don't look for it among the men. Come to me.
Well, I'll, gasped Munford. Why, I could twist you like...
Then he laughed in pure delight at Burton's spunk.
Oh, sure, I will.
It took Munford no longer than a day to get the hang of the work. He was already more than a demigod in the eyes of Bridge Gang No. 3, and that counted for much. They were eager and ready to show him what they knew themselves, whereas the ignorance and rawness of any other newcomer would have been turned to good account in the shape of jibes and jests at his expense. In 2 days, from a natural adaptability coupled with his great strength, that was the strength of 2 men, Munford had fitted into place with the same nicety that one part of a well-designed machine fits into another. To the crews of the construction trains bringing up the bridge material he was pointed out with pride by his mates, though indeed that action was superfluous, as the boy who did the trick at Pete's. And from these in turn Munford learned that down at Big Cloud Pete and others of his ilk had sworn that sooner or later they would fix him for it. At this he only laughed, and doubling his great arm bared to the shoulders, intimated that there could be no greater pleasure in life for him than to have them try it. And that night, sitting outside the camp after supper, McGuire, as spokesman, alluded to the threat, proposed that under Munford's leadership they should make another raid on Big Cloud. Burton, passing by, caught the gist of the conversation. "I want to see you a minute, Munford," he called shortly. Munford got up and followed to the foreman's little shanty that stood a few yards away from the main camp. Once inside, Burton shoved him into a chair and shook his fist under Munford's nose. "Didn't I tell you yesterday morning," he spluttered angrily, "that if you're looking for trouble to come to me and leave the gang alone? And here you're at it again, what? Go down to Big Cloud and raise hell, You great big overgrown calf!" Munford blinked at the foreman, speechless. It was a long time since he had taken words like these from any man, much less a little spitfire like Burton. "Trouble," continued the irate Burton, hardly pausing for breath. "You live on it, don't you? Eat it, Well, you'll get a fill of it before long that'll give you the damnedest indigestion you ever heard of. I promise you that. But you keep your hands off my crew. Now you listen to what I'm saying."
"Ah, go hang," said Munford contemptuously. "I can't help it, can I, if they want to go down to Big Cloud? If you're so damn anxious about 'em, it's a wonder you don't go around every night and tuck 'em into their bunks." For a moment Burton looked as though he were going to jump into Munford and mix it up then and there. But instead, with a short laugh, he turned and walked to the other side of the room, sat down on the edge of his bunk, and pulled out his pipe. He cut some tobacco from his plug, rolled it between his palms, packed his pipe slowly, and lighted it. It was 5 minutes before he broke the silence. Munford was beginning to feel uncomfortable. "I don't suppose throwing a few timbers across Twin Bear Creek means much of anything to you, Munford, he asked quietly. "Not so much," replied Munford carelessly, a little puzzled at the question. "No? But it means a lot to me, a whole lot. Until that trestle is up, we can't shove material over to the other side, ties and rail and heavy stuff. Progress on the Hill Division depends just at this minute on Bridge Gang No. 3, and concretely on me. I don't propose to have it interfered with by men going down to Big Cloud and getting their heads broke, understand?" "Oh, I guess we can take care of our heads if that's all that's bothering you," drawled Munford. And I furthermore guess your bloomin' little bridge you seem so stuck on won't take any hurt by letting the boys have their fling. Anyway, whether it will or not, what's the use of you shooting off all your talk? You can't stop 'em. If they want to go, they'll go. And say, Burton," an inspiration coming to Munford, "come on down with us. I'll promise you the time of your life." " I ought to have put it up to you differently, I guess, and saved my breath," said Burton in disgust. " You're just a hulk of bone and muscle, and your head's wood. You can lift a timber and swing a pick or axe because you've got the strength, but that's all you know, or all you're good for." The cool contempt in Burton's voice stung Munford more than the words themselves. " Is that so? " he snarled, resorting to his favorite habit of blowing on his knuckles. " I'd show you fast enough what I'm good for, you runt, if you was a little bigger." " Maybe you'll find I'm big enough one of these days," said Burton sharply. " Now I'll put it to you straight so that you'll understand. I'll show you whether I can stop this gang going to Big Cloud or not. No man rides on the construction trains after today without a pass signed by me. That's orders. If the men don't like it, you can tell them it's your fault. The next row in Big Cloud wouldn't stop at fists. And as for you, you wouldn't come out of it alive." " You needn't worry about me," sneered Munford. " You're a fool. The thickest headed, trouble hunting fool it's ever been my cursed luck to run against," exclaimed Burton angrily. Munford brushed his great shock of hair out of his eyes with a nervous sweep of his hand. " I ain't ever before taken the back talk from any man that I've taken from you without hurting him," he said thickly, rising from his chair. " And I'm going to get out of here before I hurt you." He walked quickly across the shanty and swung around in the doorway. " By God, I wish you was bigger !" he flung out. Munford walked back to the men's camp and listened to their conversation a while in sullen silence. They were still on the same topic and were waxing more enthusiastic every minute. " Aw, dry up," said Munford, cutting in at last. " It'll be a long time before any of you see Big Cloud again." " Who says so? " demanded McGuire aggressively. Munford jerked his thumb in the direction of the foreman's shanty. " Him," he said laconically. " How's he going to stop it? What for? What's the matter with you, anyway? It's none of his business." The men were talking in chorus. " He's fussy about getting his dinky little bridge through," sneered Munford. " He says he ain't going to have broken heads interfering with it, either. From now on you gotta get a pass to ride on the construction train. Likewise, he said, if you didn't like it, I was to tell you " Here Munford paused to glance around the circle. " That it's my fault and I'm the cause of all the trouble." " What did you tell him? " demanded the crew. " I told him to go hang. What else would I tell him? "" Bully for you !" shouted McGuire, slapping his leg in delight. " Did he fire you? " This was something Munford had not thought of. " Fire me? " he repeated. Then slowly, pondering the idea, " No, he didn't. It's funny he didn't, though. I gave him back talk enough." " Ah," said McGuire with a sneer, " that's easy. He'd have fired you quick enough if he dared." " Why," said Munford innocently, " I wouldn't have touched him if he had. He's too small to touch. I told him that, too." " 'Tain't that," McGuire returned. " He ain't afraid of any man, big or little. I'll give him credit for that. It's his bridge, and that means his job, that he's afraid of." " What's my getting fired got to do with the bridge? " demanded Munford in amazement. " Ah, go on, you know what I mean. If Burton has trouble with us, the bridge work stops, don't it? And the company'll be asking Burton the reason why, won't they? Well, Burton knows there's some things we won't stand for, and firing you after we brought you up here is one of them. And that's right, too, eh, mates? " There was emphatic assent from the men. Munford, a little flustered at this wholesale exhibition of homage, fidgeted nervously. " Much obliged," he said clumsily. " Don't put yourselves out on my account. " That's all right," broke in McGuire. " Burton won't try it. He knows better. As for getting a pass to get out of camp, I don't know about that." He got up, stretched himself, and yawned. " The way I look at it, it's more up to Munford here than it is to Burton. I'm going to turn in. But I'll say first that the night Munford says Big Cloud, then Big Cloud it is for Bridge Gang Number 3.
That's the way we talked it before we knew about Burton mixing in, and I reckon it stands just the same now."
And the camp retired to their bunks and to sleep, voicing McGuire's sentiments and swearing a unanimous and enthusiastic allegiance to Munford. All but Munford himself, who did not sleep, but lay awake tossing restlessly, though withal in a very self-satisfied frame of mind. This outburst of popularity pleased Munford exceedingly, the more so that it was directly traceable to his great strength and physical courage, of which he was inordinately vain. He began to regard Burton with contempt. Burton was a man whose backbone wobbled when it came to a showdown. As Munford turned the situation over in his mind, his contempt grew stronger until he came to decide that he despised the little foreman heartily. Would he demanded of himself with a snort, have fired a man that had talked to him as he had talked to Burton, had he been in Burton's place? He would! And the gang, bridge, job, and everything else could go to blazes. Munford sat up to emphasize his feelings on this point with a crash of his fist on the side of the bunk. He thrilled with the fierce joy of enacting just such a role as his imagination depicted, despising Burton accordingly for lacking in what were to him the essentials of a man. He decided, as he fell asleep, to make the foreman's life a burden to him. And he did. No flagrant violation or disobedience of orders was there. Instead, the inauguration of a petty little system of nagging that embraced every indignity Munford could think of. And the range of his attack was from profound and exaggerated attention and politeness to the utter and complete ignoring of the very existence of such a person as Allen Burton, foreman of Bridge Gang No. 3. While the gang, taking their cue from Munford, would shift from one extreme to the other with a precision and significance that cut deeper into a man of Burton's high-strung nervous temperament than any other form of torture they could have devised. 3 times during 3 days, Burton, who was afraid of no man, or aggregation of men, took the bull by the horns and struck Munford a violent blow in an effort to bring matters to a head. On the first occasion the gang watched the action with a gasp of mixed pity and admiration, looking for Burton's instant annihilation. But Munford, with a bit of a laugh, only reached out and, grasping Burton's neck, held him wriggling, helplessly, impotently, at arm's length. "You got to grow, boy. Just keep quiet now. I ain't gonna hurt you," he taunted, and the gang promptly lost their faint appreciation of Burton's nerve in their relish of the ridiculous figure cut by the white-faced, raging foreman. It was dirty work, and deep down in his heart Munford knew it. But his better nature no sooner manifested itself by sundry pricks of conscience than it was smothered beneath the new sense of authority and command that was now his for the first time in his experience, and which, catering as it did to his peacock vanity, was paramount to all things else. The work lagged sadly and fell behind. The daily reports Burton signed and sent down to headquarters became worse and worse. Each day, too, the feud between the dives at Big Cloud and Bridge Gang No. 3, fanned by the crews of the construction trains, who taunted McGuire and the men with cowardice, grew stronger. For the trainmen, having no idea of disregarding Burton's orders and allowing the bridge men to ride down on the empties, rubbed it in until the gang writhed under their jibes. Munford did not come in for much of this personally. The trainmen, none of them, seemed to display any particular hankering for discussing the question in his presence, but he got it second hand from McGuire and the gang. The outcome of it all was a decision one night after supper to board the construction train the following evening, Burton, the train crew, and the company to the contrary, and go down to Big Cloud, if they had to run the train themselves. Munford concurred in the decision by blowing very gently on his knuckles. It looked bad for the peace and quiet of Big Cloud, and it looked bad for Burton's standing with the company. Munford, as commander-in-chief, and McGuire, as chief of staff, withdrew from the circle and strolled off by themselves to perfect their plans for the next day's campaign, taking the trail in the direction of Big Cloud, a trail still called, but now a passable road due to the traffic incident to the building of the Hill Division, whose right-of-way it paralleled from Big Cloud to the ford at Twin Bear Creek. At the end of a quarter of a mile the two men sat down on a felled tree by the side of the trail to talk. Some 10 minutes had passed when McGuire, in the midst of a graphic description of what they would do to Pete McGonigle and the rest, suddenly stopped and gripped Munford tightly by the shoulder. " Keep mum," he cautioned. " There's someone coming." In the bright moonlight they could make out the figure of a man about 100 yards down the road, coming toward them from the camp.
" He walks like Burton,"
whispered McGuire.
" What the devil is he following us for? Get back into the trees and let him pass."
They moved noiselessly a little deeper into the wood that fringed the road, and lying flat, watched the man who was approaching. " It's Burton," McGuire announced at last. Munford grunted assent. " He's been following us all right, and now he's going to wait for us to come back," continued McGuire, as Burton halted within a few yards of them and sat down to smoke. " Well, we'll give him a run for his money. He can wait a while, I'm thinking." 5, 10, 15 minutes passed. McGuire began to tire of his self-selected game of hide and seek. " Come on," said he. " Let's go out and see what he wants."
" Wait," Munford answered. " There's someone coming from Big Cloud way. It's not us Burton's after. Listen."
There was a faint beat of horses' hoofs gradually drawing nearer. Then presently rider and horse loomed out of the shadows, and Burton, getting up, stepped out into the middle of the road. The horseman drew up beside him. " That you, Burton? " he called softly. " Yes," said Burton shortly. " You got Pete's letter, then," the man went on, dismounting from his horse. " I suppose it's all right to talk here, no one around, huh? " As well here as anywhere, only cut it short." " Oh, there ain't any hurry," returned the man with a laugh. " Wait till I tie my horse, then we can sit down and chew it over comfortable. Now," he went on, that task performed, " what I came to see you about was this fellow Munford." " Well," demanded Burton, " what about him? "" It looks to us down at Big Cloud, from the way the fellows on the construction trains are talking, you ain't got any cause to love him, huh? So Pete figured you and him could deal. You want to get rid of him, don't you? "" I wish to God I'd never seen his face !" exclaimed Burton, with great bitterness. " Sure, that's the idea. You don't want him? We do want him, huh? Bad. There's nothing against the rest of the men. We'll forget about that. It's just Munford we're after." " Why don't you get him, then? " said Burton curtly. " We're going to," the man replied, with a nasty laugh. " We're going to, all right. It's a fair deal. You're on, huh? Pete said you'd jump at the chance to sit in. We want you to fire him." " That's all I'm to do? " said Burton quietly. " Sure, that's all there is to it. Except this." Munford's hand closed on his companion's arm in a tight, spasmodic grip as Pete's emissary produced a wad of bills and began to peel off the outer ones. " 300 plunks," said the man, extending the money he had abstracted from the roll to Burton. " Pretty good for just firing a man we've been looking for you to fire for the last week anyway. Besides, there's been some talk down at headquarters about you not being able to handle your men, and about them getting someone that can. Pete says not to bother about that. He'll fix it for you. Here, take the money." " Suppose I fired him," said Burton slowly. " Where'd he go? "" What do you care where he goes, so long as you get rid of him? "" He couldn't go west," went on Burton, paying no attention to the other's remark. " So he'd have to go east. That's Big Cloud. And murder." He turned fiercely, savagely on the man. " You dirty, low-lived hound !" he flashed. " You offer me $300 to murder a man, do you? You wonder why I've stood for what I did, do you? You scrimp! Fire him, huh? To get a cowardly knife or shot in his back? You think I don't know what would happen if I let him out, Get out of here, you cur! And get out now, while you can!" Burton's voice rasped, hoarse with passion. He turned abruptly away and strode quickly in the direction of the camp. " Hold on, wait a minute, Burton," cried the other, following him. " Don't get batty." Unconsciously, Munford had tightened his grip on McGuire's arm until the latter whimpered with the pain, and now Munford lifted him bodily to his feet, making cautiously for the spot where the horse was standing. The two figures were still discernible, and Burton's angry voice continued to reach the listeners, though the words were now indistinguishable. Munford's face in the moonlight was colorless. The muscles around his mouth twitched convulsively. " Did you hear what they said? Did you hear what they said? My God, did you hear it all? " He was mumbling incoherently in McGuire's ear, his eyes strained up the road. " Yes, I heard it. Let go of me arm, you're breaking it." " He's coming back. said Munford hoarsely. Burton had disappeared around a turn in the road, and the man, after hesitating a moment, began to retrace his steps to his horse, muttering fiercely to himself as he came along. As he reached for the bridle, Munford leaped out and grasped him by the throat, choking back the man's cry of terror.
" You make a noise," snarled Munford, " and I'll finish you." " Oh, it's you, huh? Look here, Mac, it's a cuss that ran the roulette wheel that night at Pete's. So my price is $300, huh? Well, hand it out. Quick! "
Slowly the fellow put his hand in his pocket and for the second time that night pulled out his roll. Munford's anger seemed to have vanished. He laughed softly as he took the money.
" What are you going to do with me? "
whined the gambler. Munford made no answer. In the imperfect light he was laboriously counting the bills. McGuire watched the operation, at the same time keeping an eye on their prisoner.
$260, $80, $300,
said Munford at last, cramming the amount into his pocket and handing back by far the larger part of the roll to the man.
" What am I going to do with you? Nothing. You get on that horse and ride back to Pete. I want him to know this. Tell him all about it. Tell him Munford told you to tell him. That's worth more than breaking your neck. And that's all that saves you from getting it broke, savvy? You tell him I've got the $300, and I'll give him his chance at me for it one of these days. And when I do, my God, you ride before I begin with you."
The fellow glanced fearfully from Munford to McGuire and back again to Munford to assure himself that he was free to go. Then he clambered frantically into the saddle and, lashing his beast in a fury of terror, disappeared down the trail. Munford, with swift revulsion of mood, threw himself down on the grass, burying his face in his hands. Not a word from McGuire. He walked awkwardly up and down, whistling under his breath. After a minute, Munford looked up.
" I got to square this with Burton,"
he said brokenly. McGuire nodded.
" He's a better man than you and me and the whole gang put together."
Munford's tones were fiercely assertive. " He is that," assented McGuire with conviction. There was silence for a moment between them, then McGuire spoke. " Why didn't you take it all? " he asked.
" Take it all? " flared Munford. " I'm no thief, am I? Well, then, what's the matter with you? That's my price, ain't it? $300. That's what Pete offered for a chance to get his paws on me. Well, I'll give him his chance. You heard me promise, didn't you? That's right, huh? That's Pete's proposition, and the money's mine, ain't it?
" It is," said McGuire.
" It is, and it ain't," said Munford. " Burton could have had it if he'd sold me out, couldn't he? Well, then I'm going to see he gets it anyway."
" He wouldn't take it, not by any means he wouldn't," objected McGuire.
" Not outright, he wouldn't," agreed Munford. " I know that well enough. We got to fix it so he won't know where it come from, and so it will square me with him and you fellas too."
" How are you going to do that? " demanded McGuire.
I don't know," said Munford. " We'll talk it over with the boys. Come on back to the camp."
The next day and the day after, the gang worked like Trojans, and the lack of any sneer or incivility on their part, coupled with a subdued, expectant excitement that the men tried fruitlessly to hide, made Burton more anxious and ill at ease than during the days that had gone before. It looked like the lull before the storm, and he wondered bitterly what culminating piece of deviltry they were hatching. To the taunts of the train crew the gang grinned and said nothing. On the second day a package, addressed to Munford, came up from the east, and at noon hour the men handed it around from one to another in awestruck wonder at the magnificence of the solid gold repeater that chimed the quarters, halves, and hours, and split the seconds into fractions. It was indeed a beauty. Maybe the chain was a little massive, but the men opined that it was therefore strong. They pried open the case to read the inscription over whose wording they had wrestled most of the night. " Nifty, ain't it? " cried McGuire admiringly, and he read it aloud. " This is to certify that Alan Burton is as square as they make them, and Munford and the gang are sorry. So help us." They delivered it solemnly to Munford, who was to make the presentation, and started in a body for Burton's shanty. Burton met them at the door, his face hard and set. " So it's a showdown at last, eh, boys? " he laughed grimly. " Well, what is it? The men shoved Munford bodily forward, and he stood balancing himself sheepishly, first on one foot and then on the other, as he faced Burton. He cleared his throat painfully once or twice, then he found his voice. From a point of oratory or rhetoric, it was perhaps the lamest presentation speech on record, for Munford suddenly thrust the watch and chain into the astonished Burton's hands.
Here, take it, he sputtered. It's all written out on the inside.
And breaking through the men, he turned and fled incontinently. End of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard.